So, frankly, I'm very disappointed in the way that the debate has been framed, and this is for a couple of reasons. The first being, the framing agrees with two parties that I never think that I'd like to be associated with. The first is the Western media. They've also portrayed Pakistan as a monolithic country which doesn't have diversity, which doesn't have vibrancy, and there's no room for other religions or cultures. The second group that I really don't want to be associated with are those who say that there is only room for Muslims in Pakistan. And of course, if we did live up to the ideal of an Islamic nation, there would be room for everyone, as I will portray in my speech. But the logical fallacy that the proposition is supporting really unfolds. They've presented one option that they have, the first being that Pakistan is not Muslim enough. If Pakistan was more Muslim, then there would be pluralism, and I'll draw on that later. The second option they have is that Pakistan is too Muslim. They're saying that the only idea of an identity associated with Pakistan is that of a Sunni Islam, and that's crowded out room for everything else. And what we need to realize is that the truth really lies in the middle. Of course, there's been a domination. I'm not going to deny that there's been discrimination of minorities. But what we need to realize is that domination does not mean extinction, and it's our job to actually support those minority groups in bolstering their identity rather than suppressing it like the proposition has. So let me outline the arguments I'm going to make. The first is the concept of an Islamic republic. Like the first speaker so eloquently outlined, if we were to have an Islamic republic, what would that mean? And I'm going to draw examples from our history. The second example is, what did Jinnah actually envision? And why are we having this debate today? And the final point are about policies that are being implemented in current day Pakistan, which sort of put support our side of the argument. So, when we look at Pakistan and we look at Islam in the subcontinent, where did it originate from? So the brief history is that a bunch of Iranian invaders came to the subcontinent and started ruling over the subcontinent. Now you will notice, as often is picked out in the Indian media, that the majority population of the subcontinent remains Hindu. And why is that? It is because the brand of Islam that was imported to the subcontinent was divergent from the ardent one of the Arabian Peninsula, namely Sufism. And we've heard excerpts from Allama Iqbal. And of course, a famous quote of his is that Urdu is sweet, but Persian is sweeter. And that was a direct allusion to the Sufi shrines that he used to visit, in which pluralism was upheld. So there are lots of examples throughout Mughal history, which is essentially where we do get Islam in the subcontinent, notably Akbar, where he sort of even infused two religions together, where he brought Hinduism and Islam together. And I'm not saying that that's the current state of Pakistan, but to quote Shashi Tharoor, we really need to know where we've come from to comment on where we're going. Now, the second example, on a much more micro level and bringing it up to date, is the case of the Hindu caretaker of the Pakistani National Museum in Karachi. Now, if anyone's been to Karachi recently or seen the ARY articles, there's a Hindu caretaker in the National Museum of Pakistan, and his dad actually had the job before him. So I actually went there this time in Christmas, and I asked him what he was doing. And he was actually putting up pictures of politicians who had recently won the elections and taking down pictures of politicians that had won the previous elections. So I ask you, who is more Pakistani? Someone who has devoted their entire life to the preservation of its culture, or those heinous politicians who are asking him to do such a ridiculous thing? Now, Sadia will more eloquently than I draw on the literature and the culture that's been put forward by non-Muslims in Pakistan. Just to give you a brief example, Monto has been celebrated very recently. And of course, we shouldn't say that he's Muslim just because he was born into a Muslim family. He was a devout Marxist, devout atheist. Are we going to discredit his literature just because we would prefer if he was Muslim? I don't think so. The second is the idea of Pakistan. Now, of course, we're having this debate because there are so many ideas about the idea of Pakistan. And both sides, whether they're pro-Islamic identity or they're pro-secularism, draw on Jinnah. So we heard a quote from a particular speech of Jinnah's. I will draw a quote from the same speech in which he said that you're free to go to your temples, to your churches. Of course, it's a very famous quote. Now, supporters of secularism will say that that means that he wanted a secular state. I'll concede that the truth is more nuanced than that, but what it does mean is that there is room for non-Sunni Muslims within Pakistan, and that should be acknowledged. Now, to draw on the example of Jinnah himself, who was quoted by the first speaker, he was actually born into an Ismaili family, and then he converted into a different brand of Shiaism later in life. Now, there was a court case in 1984 in Pakistan which actually made it illegal to revise this history, because it appeared that a lot of Pakistanis after partition would have preferred if Jinnah was a sanitized Sunni Muslim. But that's, of course, against history and against the facts. So we really do need to know where we're coming from. So what was it that Jinnah wanted out of Pakistan? And I would say that the primary focus was refuge. We wanted an equal voice, an equal say, and an independent nation after independence from the British. We didn't want British Raj to be replaced by Ram Raj. And of course, I think that signified no more by the best example of this, which was the fact that Jinnah's first law minister was a Hindu. And he was a Dalit from the lowest caste. And of course, they had a very similar story to what the Muslims had at that time in India, where they were discriminated against a Congress which was dominated by Brahmins who were upper caste Hindus. And of course, Gandhi alienated himself from this group. So even the law minister, or the first ever law minister of Pakistan, was saying that I would rather be in an independent Pakistan than a Hindu India, because I think that I will seek refuge here. Now third, you may say that all the points that I've made are so historical, and yes, they're wonderful in theory, but look at the practice today. Sunni Islam is clearly dominant. Now, I want you just to compare the trajectories that are occurring in India and Pakistan. So whereas Jinnah's independence movement has been vindicated in India by the actions of Modi, where Muslims are fearing for their lives literally, we're seeing a shift in Pakistan, and that's something that it is our duty to acknowledge and not wipe clear like the proposition has done. For example, there is a Sikh pilgrimage corridor that's been opened by Imran Khan very recently, which openly allows Sikhs to travel from parts of the Punjab in India to parts of the Punjab in Pakistan. If anyone's heard of Gwadar, if you drive from Karachi to Gwadar, you can see a lot of Hindu shrines, which have been in texts, religious texts of Hindus for so many years. And finally, you need to acknowledge that our history, our Sufi history, had shrines of which were not just Muslims. In Karachi, I can name a dozen shrines in which devout Muslims go to again and again. But of course, the ironic thing for many of them, and what would be a surprise to many of them, is that they aren't Muslims at all. They're Buddhists, they're Sikhs, they're Hindus. And that's a pluralism which is rich in Pakistan particularly, and that's not something that we should shy away from. So for the sake of our history, for our philosophy, and for our current trajectory, I beg you to support the motion. Thank you.